you wanted the best, you've got the best podcast, the hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hello, this is Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com. Ladies and gentlemen, the Iron Lady season that makes it official. Welcome to the big show. As always, the Chris Voss Show. Family loves you, doesn't judge you, at least not as harshly as the rest of the world. For over 16 years and 2,300 episodes, we bring you the most brilliant people, the smartest minds, the wonderful stories, the things you learn in life from their journeys, through their research, and everything they do. Today, we have an amazing young lady on the show. Lynne Olson joins us for her new book coming out June 3rd, 2025. It is entitled The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, How an Intrepid brand. Here, let me recut this. I've got a camera in front of it. The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, How an Intrepid band of Frenchwomen resisted the Nazis in Hitler's all-female concentration camp. We're going to get into some of the details and research that she did and find out more about this story that needs to be told. She is a New York Times bestselling author of 10 books of history. She's the former U.S. Secretary of State. Madeleine Albright has called her our era's foremost chronicler of World War II politics and diplomacy. Her latest book will be published by Random House on June 3rd, 2025. Her earlier books include 3 New York Times bestsellers, and we're going to get into it with her. Welcome to the show, Lynne. How are you?
I am fine, thank you, Chris. How are you?
I am good. If I can learn how to pronounce stuff this morning. So give us the .coms. Where can people find you on the interwebs?
I have a website, www.lynneolson.com, LYNNEOLSON.com.
And did I get the name of the institution right? Ravensbrück?
Ravensbrück, yeah.
So give us a 30,000 overview. What's inside the new book?
It's a story of a group of French women who were very prominent in the French resistance during World War II, who were captured by the Gestapo during their resistance activities and were sent to the only German concentration camp designed for women, and that was Ravensbrück. It was about 80 miles south of Berlin. And the book talks about what they did in the resistance in Paris and the other parts of France that they were in, but it focuses on what happened to them at Ravensbrück. And it's really the story of how these women came together, formed a sisterhood there in order to keep each other alive, first of all, but then also to stand up against the Germans. They actually resisted the Nazis in the camp itself. Wow.
There's a lot of great stories that we've seen come out in a lot of different interviews we've done of different book authors of resistance and, the Poland ghettos, the Jewish ghettos that they threw all the Jewish people into, and, how they would resist, how they would, they would transport different, things people needed. And sometimes they would have the Nazis help carry in whatever sort of like bombs and stuff. They're like thinking they're carrying bread. Yeah. There's a lot of stories of survival and hope and the thing that carries humans through just about everything. And of course, these French women, the French resistance, of course, was a big narrative from the war. How did you discover this story? How did it come to you?
It came really from another book, from several other books I've written. As you mentioned, I've written 10 books, and almost all of them have to do with World War II. Initially, my focus has really been to look for people, what I call unsung heroes, people who have contributed greatly in terms of the war to their country and the world, but who for various reasons have fallen into the cracks of history. My initial books, my first few, 5 or 6 books really focused on England during the early days of the war, but I switched my focus to France. And my last 3 books have been about women in the French resistance, various women. And so the idea for this book, the Ravensbrück book, did come out of things I had learned in my research for the previous books. So one book really led to another.
And I've read that, I've read that, survival in the camps sometimes depended upon a lot of moxie in being able to either negotiate or hide or because they would round up people and dispose of them, sadly. And so, yeah, were you able to, I saw some video before the show that I was watching on some of the different stuff and saw some the older ladies that were being interviewed. Did you get a chance to sit down and interview some of the people that you talk about in the book?
No, excuse me. Unfortunately, I really focus on 4 women. Mm-hmm. And even though the group of French women was obviously much bigger than that mm-hmm. they worked with. But no, all 4 of them, unfortunately, have died. But they died, actually, it's very interesting. They died, all of them, in quite old age. Mm-hmm. But I did get a chance to talk to relatives of them. Mm-hmm. And one particular, the granddaughter of one of them. And, I was able to talk to people who knew them, but unfortunately I didn't get a chance to talk to them themselves. But there was so much material, Chris. I mean, all of these women wrote memoirs of some kind or another. And so you got a really good sense of who they were and what they had gone through. But there was also a young American documentary filmmaker who interviewed these women like more than 30 years ago. Wow. And I think she had, it was like about 30 hours of interviews with them, together and also separately. So she made a 1-hour documentary, but there are these 28 hours of interviews, and I got a chance to look at the transcripts and use the transcripts of what they said. And it was astonishing. I mean, they were really open about what it was like to go through this, how important it was, how much their friendship meant to them. So even though I didn't get a chance to talk to them, I felt like I almost did, because I got so much information in other ways.
There's so many stories throughout history, and a lot of them get lost. Tell us about this camp. I was listening to the details of this camp, and it was just sheer horror.
It was, as I said, the only camp designed solely for women. About 130,000 women from all over occupied Europe were sent there. Most of them had been members of resistance groups in their countries. And it was, I write about France, but it was also women from Belgium, women from the Netherlands, a lot of women from Poland, a lot of women from Russia and Germany. So it was made up mostly of women who had rebelled against the Germans. And about 130,000 women went there, and at least probably well over 40,000 died there in various ways. It was not an extermination camp like Auschwitz, where the people who went there, who were mostly Jews, were killed almost as soon as they got there. This was a labor camp, and it makes it sound like, okay, that's not as bad, but basically the Germans had the same goal. These women were going to die. They would die later. I mean, they would be worked to death, basically. They would be worked to death, or they would be killed in some other way. But the Germans didn't plan to have any of them leave that camp alive. Yeah. But so we know a lot about some of these camps, right? We know about Dachau. We know about Buchenwald. But history is really forgotten Ravensbrück. And one of the main reasons is that in Buchenwald, for example, were both liberated by American troops, troops and British troops. And so as a result of that they were American troops, there were American journalists along the ride. They were covering the troops. They entered those camps with the troops. They saw what was going on. They took photos. They wrote stories. There's film footage in newsreels, and we've all seen them, it's horrific. Images of stacks of dead bodies and skeleton-like survivors. Ravensbrück was not liberated by the Americans or the British. They were liberated by the Soviets, by Soviet troops. And there were no American journalists with Soviet troops. There's none of there's none of the evidence that came out of Dachau and Buchenwald. There are no photos. There's no footage. In that way, it was women. The women were forgotten. And so basically, and that's still true. People don't know about the atrocities that happened at Ravensbrück. They don't even know about Ravensbrück. But they also don't know about the courage that these women, many of these women, showed when they were there. And they don't know particularly the story of, the women who actually rose up against the Germans in that camp.
Mm-hmm. They also were doing, I guess, according to your book, medical experiments as well. I just insane. There was one gal I watched in one of the videos I saw, and she talked about how they removed one of her bones. I didn't stick around long enough to find out what.
You did your research, yeah.
And I was I was like, I don't want to know what the rest of this goes. I got to do a show where we might get a joke in or two. But not to discount the horror of all of this. It's just the brevity of seeing, and the horror of just hearing some of the stories that I heard, and of course the stuff you recount in your book. It's just overwhelming, but it's a story that has to be told, and the one thing man can learn from his history is man never learns from his history, and thereby we go round and round. And so when you see the same sort of horrors popping up in today's world, you see what's going on with the Uyghurs in China, et cetera, we just seem to never learn. So it's important these stories get told for that reason.
Absolutely. You brought up the medical experiments, and they were horrific. They really were. They were mostly performed on young Polish prisoners. The Poles actually had the best organized resistance movement in all of occupied Europe. They were by far the best. And so there were a lot of young Polish women who were sent to Ravensbrück, and they were used as guinea pigs in these experiments that you were talking about. A number of them died almost immediately after them. But a lot of them survived, but were crippled for the rest of their lives because they had these. But it's just horrible. But there's also part of the story is the fact that they were saved. In the end of the war, the Germans were planning to kill the survivors of experiments to get rid of all the evidence. There, and so that the world would know what had happened, and the whole camp of Ravensbrück knew that this was about to happen. And in February 1945, the word circulated among the camp that the SS was about to execute these Poles. And what happened is that the whole camp rebelled. I mean, the whole camp just kind of stood up and said, we're not going to let this happen. And in fact, they succeeded in that. That there was an attempt by the SS to execute these young Polish girls. But it's a long story, but it's such an incredible triumph that these women, this is toward the end of the war, obviously. It was just about 4 months before the war ended. The women of all nationalities, the French led the way, but the Russians, the Germans, everybody came together and hid these young Poles. And they were never found. I mean, in other words, they all survived.
Wow.
At the end of the war. And that was extraordinary. Nothing like that had ever happened, but it just shows that the courage and the ability, when you're faced with that kind of awfulness, if you come together, if there's solidarity, if there's a sisterhood, that can, in fact, do things that you couldn't do on your own.
In your view, what were the key strengths or characteristics that allowed these women to maintain their resistance efforts and through the hardship of it all?
That's a really good question. They didn't let people tell them what to do. I mean, virtually all the women in the resistance kind of grew up not accepting the role of women, for example, in French society. I mean, France back then, and to some extent still is, a very patriarchal, traditional, conservative society. And most of the women I write about, from the time they were young, said, no, I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm not going to, confine my life to being a mother and wife. I have plans. I have ideas. I am smart. I'm as smart as men, and I'm going to do what I want to do. I'm not going to let men tell me what to do. And I think that was not just for the women I write about, but that was kind of an overarching quality that especially women had. Because in all these countries, when we're talking about the 30s and 40s, women were in virtually all the countries that, France, Poland, Germany, the women were second-class citizens. But women who joined the resistance and who were active basically were rebels. And they said, no, we're gonna be our own people, and we are going to, we'll fight for our country just like the men do. And and they did.
Well, it was an interesting thing. I mean, it's hope springs anew with human nature, and to see it sometimes at its best in our worst of times is definitely an homage to who we are sometimes when we're better human beings or better angels, I suppose, might be a way to say it. What was the most challenging aspect of researching it and telling the stories of the survivors?
Oh, one of the challenges for me is, and you've indicated, this is a very tough story to write and research. And, I did a lot of research about what happened. Mm-hmm. And it was difficult. I mean, there were times when I thought, oh my, and I'm just writing about it. I clearly didn't go through it, but it was just very, very difficult. And the only thing that kept me going was to know that the women who did, have to undergo the horrors managed to tough it out, managed to, as I said, come together, managed to, form these incredibly strong friendships and worked to help each other throughout the whole time they were there, and then worked with each other to fight back. And so that kind of, that sense of hope, that sense of courage, that sense of whatever, kind of overrode the difficulties of writing about the evils that they went through. I mean, you were talking about today, and I think it's very timely what these women did. I mean, it's by themselves, they could do nothing, by themselves. If they didn't have the other people, they would have died probably very soon after they got there. But because they knew that they had to stick together, the power of coming together was incredible. And I think that's true now. I mean, by yourself, you can't really do anything if you see something that you see is wrong. But if you come together, there's a lot you can do.
Rising tide lifts all boats. I mean, when we work together as human beings as one, we do amazing things. When we, infight with each other and stuff, it doesn't work out so well. I think in your book you talk about what their journey was after. Do you want to after the war, and how they handled their stories and et cetera, et cetera? Can you tease out a little bit of that?
Sure. To me, that was one of the most interesting parts of writing the book. It wasn't, I think, a lot of books, there have been a lot of books, as you know, written about resistance in France and in other places, but definitely in France. But they tend to focus almost solely on what these people, whether they were men or women, did during the war, their acts of resistance, and not so much on what happened after the war. But these women basically decided that they were going to continue that kind of work after the war. They came out of the war as an afterthought. Basically the men in the resistance, the histories and the initial reaction after the war was that men were the main actors in the resistance, and that women were an afterthought. And that came from General Charles de Gaulle down, that only men had played important roles in the resistance. Where in fact, women were the lifeblood of the resistance. They did everything that men did and more. They helped organize the first resistance networks in France. They ran escape lines. They collected intelligence. They, transported arms. They did everything.
Still carried out assassinations and
absolutely,
and other things. Yeah.
Right. Without them, the resistance, without women, resistance could not have functioned at all. But as I said, when it was over, the men took the credit and basically, relegated women to the sidelines and to the shadows. And these women who the survivors of Ravensbrück would have none of that. I mean, they had done the same things. They had resisted just as much as the men. They had undergone the brutal treatment in the concentration camps just as much as men. And they were not about to let men put them, in the shadows. And so they formed they formed an activist organization after the war, made up only of women, former women prisoners in concentration camps and German prisons. And they, again, just as they had done at Ravensbrück, they banded together to help each other survive, because many, if not most, survivors were in really bad shape, psychologically and physically. I mean, many died very shortly after they came back from the war. So this organization actually had a hospital. It had rest homes. It had this incredible network of social services that were available for women, not just for their physical health, but for their mental health too. Yeah. And they also did not stop their work, in terms of fighting injustice and, fighting against equality. It continued for the rest of their lives until they were old women. One of them, I should mention, was the niece of de Gaulle, General de Gaulle. Her name is Geneviève de Gaulle. Oh, wow. And even though his own niece had been incredibly important in the resistance movement, he just ignored what women had done. But they had done extraordinary things, and they kept doing extraordinary things until they died. And there's one kicker that kind of shows the importance of them. In 2015, 10 years ago, there was a ceremony inducting 4 people who had been involved in the resistance into the Pantheon, the French Pantheon. The French Pantheon is where French heroes are buried in Paris. And up to that point, up to 2015, only 71 people had been judged worthy of that honor, including, great heroes of French history, but only one woman. So there were 71, 70 were men, one was a woman, and that was Marie Curie. So in 2015, 4 more people were judged worthy of being put in, to be added to the Pantheon. 2 of them are women. So 2 of them, and they were going to join Marie Curie as the only women. And those 2 both were women that I write about in this book. Both of them were survivors of Ravensbrück. And one was Geneviève de Gaulle, and the other was Germaine Tillion. It shows the importance of not only of them, but what they did, in terms of French history.
I mean, we've had authors on the book that have talked about one of the things that the Jewish women in the Jewish Poland ghettos, I think they called them, they were able to get by the guards and do all sorts of stuff to subvert the will of the German people. And the German guards just kind of discounted them. They would flirt with them. And I think there were stories of them carrying grenades or bombs or bomb-making equipment in baskets that the women would ring back, and they would actually get the guards to carry the stuff in chivalrous nature. And it was funny to hear, and the stories of assassinations, and so they were kind of discounted and not seen as, well, they're not men, they're not going to fight us or kill us, but yet they were pretty good at getting stuff done.
Absolutely, that happened in France too. That, especially in the beginning of the war, until the Germans caught on that the women actually were, fighters. But it's the same thing. It was, they, as you say, they discounted women. They thought, pretty young girl, she's not going to be. She's not going to be carrying a grenade, or she's not going to have a revolver, or she can't possibly be a spy. And the women did just as in Poland, women in France played on that. Absolutely.
There you go. So what do you hope people come away as they read the book? What do you hope they learn from the stories that you've told in there?
I think what I referred to earlier, that when you feel like there is nothing you can do, when you see something, that some injustice or whatever, and you feel I am just alone. I can't do anything. You read this book, and you'll see how you, along with other people, can change the world, and that's what they did. These women in this horrific place where the least little thing could get you killed had the courage to test that. And the reason why they were successful is because they joined together. As I said, they became a sisterhood. And by doing that, by helping each other, they obviously weren't able to bring down the camp, but they were able to help themselves and other people survive and to make their mark, to rebel against the Germans.
The one thing man can learn from his history is that man never learns from his history. Thereby, these historical books are so important for us to read, for us to learn the human condition of people. It's just, I really get tired of history repeating itself.
I totally agree. As a historian, you see it happen, and you keep telling people, look, this is what happens if you do X, Y, and Z. And you're right. Nobody pays attention. And I think it's the further away we get from World War II.
Yeah.
Because, most of the people alive today in this country and elsewhere were certainly not alive. And in fact, probably their parents were alive during World War II. They're probably gone. So they really have no connection at all with this horrific war, and it's what happened as a result of it. And so you're absolutely right. It is really, really depressing that we don't learn from our history.
Yeah. If I could get more people to read the Federalist Papers and the Constitution these days, that would be great. So thank you for coming on the show. We really appreciate it. And thank you for telling your story. Give us your .coms as we go out, please, where people can find you on the interwebs.
It's www.lynneolson.com.
Thank you very much for coming on the show, Lynne. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Chris. This was fun.
Thank you. And thanks for tuning in. Order the book wherever fine books are sold. It's out June 3rd, 2025. It is called The Sisterhood of Ravensbrück, How an Intrepid Band of Frenchwomen Resisted the Nazis in Hitler's all-female concentration camp. Definitely the stories we need to learn about in the history so that we don't repeat them anymore. Can we start doing that? That'd be great, folks. Let's start today. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, everyone. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, linkedin.com/Chris Voss, Chris Voss 1 on the TikTokity, and all those crazy places on the internet. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you next time. And that should have us out. Great show.